She was 91 years old, and she was dying. And even then, even with the hospice nurses coming and going, even with the oxygen tube under her nose and her hands shaking the way they did, she almost didn't tell me. She pulled me close, and she whispered for words that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. She said, "I had a baby." And I remember sitting there holding her hand thinking, what? Because my grandmother had been married to my grandfather for 68 years. She had 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and a life I thought I knew by heart. She baked pies on Sunday mornings. She kept a Bible on her nightstand. She never raised her voice. Not once in my entire life. And here she was, with her eyes wet and her voice breaking, telling me she had a secret. A baby. A daughter. One she gave away in 1954. 70 years. She had carried this for 70 years. Alone. Let me take you back to the beginning of all this. Because the story didn't start in that hospice room. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was at work. I'm a middle school librarian in Columbus, Ohio, and I remember I was shelving books in the fiction section when my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was my mom. I almost didn't answer. We had a complicated relationship at that point. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet distance that sometimes grows between a mother and a daughter when neither of them is quite sure how to close it. But I answered. She said, "Grandma is asking for you specifically." Just you. I remember the way she said it. There was something careful in her voice. Something held back. I said, "Is she okay?" My mom paused just a moment too long. "She's comfortable. But the doctor said, it's close, honey. You should come." My grandmother, Grandma Ruth, we always called her, lived in Grand Junction, Colorado. She'd lived there her whole life, except for 2 years in the late 1940s when she'd gone to live with her aunt in Cincinnati. That's actually where she met my grandfather, Harold. He was working at a hardware store. She was 19 and restless and homesick, and apparently he made her laugh on their very first meeting. She always said that was the only qualification that mattered. They got married in 1955, moved back to Grand Junction, built a house, built a life, built a family. My grandfather passed away in 2019, and ever since, Grandma Ruth had been slowing down. Quietly, gracefully, the way she did everything. I drove from Columbus to Grand Junction. It took 2 days. I didn't fly because, honestly, I needed those 2 days. I needed the highway and the flat Midwest fields turning into hills and then mountains. I needed the time to prepare myself to say goodbye to the woman who had shaped more of who I am than anyone else on this earth. She was the one who taught me to read. She was the one who stayed on the phone with me for 3 hours the night my first marriage fell apart. She was the one who, every single birthday, without fail, mailed me a card with a handwritten note inside. Not a text, not an email, a card. In her looping, old-fashioned cursive. I kept every single one of them. So I drove. I listened to old country music because that's what she loved. And I cried a little somewhere around the Kansas border because I already knew that the world was about to get a little less warm. Grandma Ruth was at a place called Sunset Ridge. It was a nice facility, the kind with plants in the hallways and staff members who actually remembered your name. She had a corner room with a window that faced west, and when I arrived late on that second afternoon, the sun was going down over the mountains in a way that looked almost too beautiful to be real. She was awake. She looked smaller than I remembered, fragile in a way that hit me somewhere deep in my chest. But her eyes were the same, sharp and brown and full of something. Full of her. When she saw me come through the door, she smiled. And she said, "There she is, my Claire Bear." She hadn't called me that since I was about 7 years old. I sat down next to her. I took her hand. We talked for a while about nothing important, the drive, the weather, whether I'd eaten anything decent. She asked about my daughter, Maya, who was 14 and going through what we politely called a phase. I made her laugh. That felt like everything. My mom was there and my Uncle Dennis and his wife Karen. We all took turns sitting with her, talking softly, watching the mountains out the window turn from gold to purple to dark. That night, just before the nurses came in for the evening check, Grandma Ruth squeezed my hand and said, "Tomorrow morning, come early. I need to tell you something before I don't have the strength anymore." I looked at her. "Tell me something?" "Just you, Claire," she said. "Come early." I barely slept that night. I was staying at a Holiday Inn about 2 miles from Sunset Ridge, and I lay in that stiff hotel bed staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine what she could possibly want to tell me. I ran through every possibility. Maybe it was something about the house, or a piece of jewelry she wanted me to have. Maybe it was something about my mother, something she wanted me to understand about their relationship. I never once guessed what it actually was. I arrived at Sunset Ridge at 7:15 the next morning. The facility was quiet. The hallways smelled like coffee and something floral, probably plug-in air fresheners, but it was comforting somehow. Grandma Ruth was already awake. She was sitting up in bed, and there was a small wooden box on her lap, about the size of a shoebox, but older, worn at the corners, with a little brass clasp. I had never seen that box before in my life. I sat down. I said good morning. She said good morning. And then she looked at me with those sharp brown eyes and she said, "Close the door, sweetheart." I closed the door. She held the box for a long moment. Just held it, like she was gathering something. Courage, maybe. Or maybe just the right words after 70 years of not saying them. And then she looked at me and she said, "Before your grandfather, before any of it, there was a man." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just listened. His name was Thomas. Thomas Waverly. She was 18 when she met him, the summer before she went to Cincinnati. He was 22, the son of a ranching family 2 towns over. She described him the way you only describe your first real love, with a kind of reverent, aching precision. Dark hair, quiet hands, a laugh that started slow and built like a wave. He read books. That was important to her. He read books, and he took her seriously, and he was kind in a way that she said was rare for men of that era in that place. They fell in love the way young people fall in love when they don't yet know how much the world can complicate things. Completely, recklessly, without a single thought for what came next. And then the summer ended, and she found out she was pregnant. She stopped talking for a moment. She looked down at the box in her hands. I said, very quietly, "Grandma?" "Let me finish," she said. "I've been starting and stopping the story for 70 years. I need to get to the end of it." In 1953, in a small town in western Colorado, an unmarried 19-year-old girl from a church-going family did not get to keep her baby. That was simply not how things worked. That is not an excuse. That is just the truth of what the world was then. Her parents found out. Her father, my great-grandfather, a man I only knew from one photograph, did not yell. She said that would have been easier, in a way, if he had yelled. Instead, he sat her down at the kitchen table and he told her, calmly, that she was going to go stay with her Aunt Patrice in Cincinnati until the baby was born. And then the baby would be placed with a family. And then she would come home, and this would never be spoken of again. Thomas Waverly was not consulted. She never saw him again. She went to Cincinnati in January of 1954. She was 5 months along. Her aunt was a quiet woman, not unkind, but not warm either. She did what she was told, cared for my grandmother adequately, and made sure the arrangement went smoothly. The baby was born on April 9th, 1954. A girl. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Dark hair, Thomas's hair, my grandmother said. She held her for 45 minutes. 45 minutes. And then a nurse came in and took the baby away, and my grandmother never saw her again. She said she named her, in her own heart. She named her June, because it was the kind of name that sounded like something hopeful, even if hope was the last thing she felt in that moment. She went back to Colorado 3 weeks later. She met my grandfather Harold a few months after that. She married him in 1955. She built her life. She raised her children. She loved her husband. She was happy. She was genuinely happy, she said, and she needed me to understand that. She didn't spend 68 years pretending. She loved Harold. She built something real and good with him. But June was always there, in the back of everything. A quiet, permanent ache. She opened the box. Inside the wooden box there were a few things. A small hospital identification bracelet. Newborn size. So small it looked like it could fit around 2 fingers. Baby girl Mercer, her maiden name, April 9th, 1954. A single photograph. Blurry, black and white. A woman in a hospital bed holding a bundled infant. My grandmother, at 19. Looking down at a face I couldn't make out clearly. But the expression on her face, even in a blurry photograph, 60-odd years old, was unmistakable.
And a letter.
A letter she had written to June over the years. Not one letter. Many letters. Pages and pages. In that same looping cursive I knew from all my birthday cards. She had been writing to June since 1954. Letters she never sent. Letters June never knew existed. About everything. Harold's proposal. The birth of her first child, my Uncle Dennis, and how she had cried for 3 days after he was born. Not from sadness, but because holding a baby again had opened something in her she thought she'd sealed shut. My mother's childhood. Grandchildren. Seasons. Things she saw that were beautiful and things that were hard and things she just wanted to say to somebody who was hers. 70 years of letters. To a daughter who didn't know she existed. I was crying by then. I'm not even sure when I started. I was just holding my grandmother's hand with both of mine, and the tears were coming down, and I couldn't stop them. Why are you telling me now? I asked. Why me? She looked at me for a long moment, and she said something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She said, because I'm almost out of time, and because I think you might know her. My mother's best friend's name was Carol. Carol Hensley, or Carol Hensley Burke, after she got married in the late 1980s. She had been my mother's best friend for as long as I could remember, the kind of friend who was at every Christmas, every Easter, every birthday dinner. The kind of friend who becomes so embedded in a family that the word friend starts to feel inadequate. We called her Aunt Carol. I had called her Aunt Carol since I was probably 4 years old.
Carol was adopted.
I knew that. I had always known that in the vague, background way you know things about people you've been around your whole life. She didn't talk about it much. Her adoptive parents had both passed away by the time I was a teenager. She had looked, briefly, for her birth family when she was in her 30s. She hadn't found anything. She said she made her peace with it. Carol was born in 1954. I sat in that hospice room, and I did the math in my head, and I felt the floor shift under me.
I said, Grandma.
Are you saying what I think you're saying? She said, I don't know for certain. I've thought about it for years. I've noticed things. The way she laughs. Certain things about her face that remind me of... She paused. Of Thomas. Of his family. Have you ever looked into it?
I didn't know how, she said.
And I was afraid. I was afraid of what it might do. To Carol. To your mother. To everything. You were afraid of disrupting people's lives. I was afraid, she said simply.
And she looked at me.
But I'm almost out of time now, Claire. And I can't take this with me and leave her not knowing. If it's her. If there's even a chance it's her. She deserves to know she was wanted. That she was named. That not a day went by. She pressed the wooden box into my hands.
Find out, she said.
And if it's her, please tell her. Tell her I named her June. Tell her I wrote to her. Every year. Tell her she was loved. I sat in my rental car in the parking lot of Sunset Ridge for a long time after that. I called my mom. I didn't tell her everything. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet, and honestly, it wasn't mine to have first. I just said Grandma and I had talked and that I needed a few days to process some things. My mom, to her credit, didn't push. She just said, "Okay, honey. She loves you. We all do." I called my own daughter Maya and talked to her for 20 minutes about absolutely nothing, just because I needed to hear her voice. And then I sat there, and I thought about Carol. I had Carol's number. Of course I had Carol's number. I'd had it since I was old enough to have a phone. She lived in Denver now, had for the past 15 years or so since her divorce. We talked a few times a year, holidays, birthdays, occasional check-ins. She was warm and funny, and just a little bit sad in the way that some people carry a quiet sadness like a stone in their pocket. Always there. Not crippling. Just there. I didn't call her that night. I went back to my hotel. I opened the wooden box and I read through some of the letters. Just a few. I didn't read all of them. Those were Carol's to read if it came to that. But I read a few. And I want to tell you, if you've never read a letter written by a mother to a child she gave away, it is one of the most quietly devastating things in the world. Not dramatic. Not angry. Just honest. Honest and full of love and so lonely. One of the letters was from 1968. My grandmother was in her early 30s by then. She wrote about seeing a girl about 14, she guessed, on the street in town, and how for just a split second she'd thought, and then she wrote, "I know it wasn't you, but I thought about you all day after that. I hope wherever you are, someone is taking good care of you. I hope you have a mother who braids your hair. I hope you know you were not put away, because you weren't enough. You were more than enough. You were everything. That's why it was so hard." I had to close the box after that. I called Carol 3 days later. I didn't tell her on the phone. I couldn't. I told her I was in Colorado visiting Grandma Ruth and that I'd love to drive up to Denver and see her if she was free. She said she'd love that. She'd heard Grandma Ruth was declining and she wanted to know how she was doing. We met at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill. Carol was 69, white-haired now, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a laugh that came quick and genuine. She hugged me hard when she saw me. We sat down. We ordered coffee. We talked for a while. And then I said, "Carol, I need to ask you something, and I need you to know before I ask it that whatever the answer is, it doesn't change anything between us or in our family." She put her coffee cup down. She looked at me carefully. "Okay," she said. I said, "Do you remember telling me, when I was in high school, that you'd looked for your birth family and hadn't found anything?" A pause. "Yes." "And you were born April 9th, 1954. Her eyes were very still. "Yes." I said, "My grandmother had a daughter. In Cincinnati. April 9th, 1954. She gave her up for adoption, and she has spent 70 years wondering what happened to her. She named her June." Carol didn't move. She didn't speak. She just sat there, and I watched something pass across her face that I don't have adequate words for. It was like watching a door open in a house that had been locked for a very long time. Her hands were shaking when she finally picked up her coffee cup again, just to have something to hold. She said, "Ruth?" "She thinks it might be you," I said. "She noticed things. Over the years. But she didn't know how to find out, and she was afraid to disrupt things." I paused. "She's running out of time, Carol. She wanted me to find out. She wanted you to know, if it's you, that you were named. That she wrote to you every year. That she never stopped thinking about you." Carol pressed her hand over her mouth. She cried. I cried. The barista behind the counter politely pretended not to notice. After a while, Carol said, "How do we know for sure?" I had already looked into it. "A DNA test," I said. "They're fast now. We could have results in a week." She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Yes." We did the tests that week. Home DNA kits, the kind you can order online and return with a saliva sample. Simple. Accessible. Modern science doing something quietly miraculous in a small plastic tube. We did not tell my mother yet, or anyone else. We agreed to wait for the results. Those were a long 7 days. I stayed in Colorado. I visited Grandma Ruth every morning. We talked about her life, about Harold, about the years. She told me things I'd never known. Not secrets, mostly. Just the texture of a life I thought I knew and was only now beginning to fully see. How she'd almost moved to California once. How she had a dog named Chester for 16 years and missed him almost as much as she'd missed any person. How she taught herself to paint watercolors in her 60s and didn't think she was very good, but did it anyway because the act of making something felt important. She asked me every day if I'd spoken to Carol. I said yes. I told her Carol was open to finding out. I told her Carol wasn't angry. She'd asked me twice to make sure of that. She wasn't angry. Grandma Ruth closed her eyes and breathed out slowly, like she'd been holding that breath for a while. On the 6th day, I read her one of her own letters. She'd asked me to. She chose the one from April 9th, 1980, June's 26th birthday. In that letter, she'd written about the spring weather and a recipe she'd made and the way the mountains looked that morning. And at the end, she'd written, "Happy birthday, my June. I hope today was good to you. I hope your life is full of things that are worth getting up for." She listened with her eyes closed and her hands folded on the blanket. When I finished, she said, "That was a good one." On the 7th day, the results came in. I called Carol at 6 in the morning. I know that's early. She answered on the second ring. She'd been awake. I said, "Carol." She said, "Tell me." I said, "It's you." The sound she made, I won't try to describe it. Some sounds are beyond description. Some sounds are just what 70 years of an unanswered question sounds like when it finally gets its answer. We both cried. Again. We'd been doing a lot of that. I said, "She's still here, Carol. She's still here, and she wants to see you." Carol drove down from Denver that same afternoon. I had told my mother by then. That was a hard conversation. My mom sat very quietly for a long time after I finished telling her. Then she said, very slowly, "Carol is my sister." "Half-sister," I said carefully. Another long silence. "That's why she always felt like family," my mom said. I always said that. I always said Carol felt like family. She cried too. But by the end of the call, she was on her way to Sunset Ridge. When Carol arrived, I was waiting for her in the parking lot. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her hair was less tidy than usual, and she was wearing a blue sweater, and she had her hands clasped in front of her the way people do when they're trying to hold themselves together. We walked in together, down the hall with the plants, past the nursing station. I pushed open the door to Grandma Ruth's room. Grandma Ruth was awake, sitting up. She had asked one of the nurses to help her brush her hair that morning. She had the wooden box on the bed beside her. Carol stepped inside. They looked at each other. I don't have words for what happened in that room. I was standing in the doorway, and I watched two women, a 91-year-old woman and a 69-year-old woman, find each other for the first time after 70 years, and I understood in that moment that there are things that happen in life that language is simply not equipped for. There are moments that exist outside of words. Grandma Ruth held out her hands. Carol crossed the room and took them. And Grandma Ruth said, "June." And Carol, who had been Carol her whole life, who had made a life and a self out of not knowing, Carol just said, "I'm here. I'm right here." They held each other for a long time. My mother was in the corner of the room, crying quietly. I was in the doorway. Even the nurse who had come to check vitals paused and stepped back and let the moment breathe. Carol came back every day after that. She and Grandma Ruth talked. Hours of talking. Grandma Ruth told her about Thomas, her father, a man Carol had never known existed, who had died in 1987, but whose family, Grandma Ruth thought, might still be around. Carol took all the letters from the wooden box. She read them alone, over 2 nights, and she told me afterward that it was the hardest and most beautiful thing she had ever done. She wrote about me like I was real, Carol said. All those years, like I was a real person she knew, like she could see me. She could, I said. In her way, she could. My mother and Carol sat together one afternoon in the facility's small garden while I sat with Grandma Ruth. Through the window, I could see them talking. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but at one point my mother reached over and took Carol's hand. And they just sat there like that, two women who had known each other for 40 years and were only now understanding exactly what they were to each other. Grandma Ruth passed away 11 days after Carol came to see her. She went quietly, early on a Thursday morning, with my mother holding one hand and Carol holding the other. I was in the hallway. I know some people would have wanted to be in the room, but I chose to stand in the hallway. I don't know why. It just felt right. Like Grandma Ruth deserved that last moment with the two daughters she'd always had, the one she'd raised, and the one she'd carried in her heart. When my mother came out, she looked at me and said, "She went peaceful." I nodded. She hugged me for a long time. People ask me, sometimes, if I'm angry that she kept the secret so long. I think about that. I think about the world she lived in. I think about being 19 years old with no choices in 1954 in a world that did not offer young women the grace or the options or the dignity they deserved. I think about the terror of telling and the grief of not telling and the impossible middle space she lived in for 70 years.
And no,
I'm not angry. I'm in awe of her, honestly. Not because she kept the secret, but because she kept the love. Alive and tended and carefully written down in letters for 70 years, for a daughter she wasn't allowed to keep. That is not weakness. That is not shame. That is a form of faithfulness I don't know if I'm capable of. Carol has been in contact with Thomas Waverley's family. He had a brother who is still living, an 86-year-old man in Grand Junction named Arthur, who cried when Carol called him and said, "I knew Thomas had a girl. I always suspected. I hope she was out there somewhere." She is. She was. She always was. My daughter Maya spent a week with Carol last summer. They went to the mountains. Maya came home and said, "Aunt Carol is really cool, Mom." Then she paused and said, "Is she really my great-aunt?"
she really is, I said. Maya thought about that.
That's kind of amazing, she said, that she was just there the whole time.
She was. She was just there the whole time.
And Grandma Ruth, my grandmother, who baked pies on Sunday mornings and kept her Bible on the nightstand and never once raised her voice in all the years I knew her, she held a secret for 70 years. Not out of selfishness, not out of shame, but out of protection, out of love, out of an impossible situation that she handled with more grace than most of us could manage. She told the truth in the end. At 91, with her hands shaking and her voice soft, she gave that truth to the right person, and she trusted me to carry it forward. I am carrying it forward. I think about her every single day. I hear old country music, and I think of her. I write a birthday card to someone by hand, and I think of her. I look at my daughter's face, and I think of her. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light is going golden and the world feels still, I think about a 19-year-old girl holding a baby for 45 minutes in a hospital room in Cincinnati, naming her June in the privacy of her own heart, and then spending 70 years writing her letters she never sent. I think about the kind of love that does not require an audience, the kind of love that just keeps going, quietly, faithfully, even when there is no one to witness it. That was my grandmother. That was Ruth. And I am so grateful, more than I know how to say, that she told me the truth. If this story moved you the way it moved me to live it, I hope you'll stay a while. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. Stories about real families, real love, real secrets, and the grace it takes to face the truth. If you have a grandmother, call her today. Not for any reason. Just to hear her voice. You never know what she might be carrying. You never know what she might be waiting to say. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next story. I'll be right back with another one soon.